to go one step further and talk about 3 different cases. And these stories are true stories. Some of the information has been changed to protect confidentiality. But I want to share 3 different stories of individuals from totally different walks of life, because I want to begin to help you understand and help you see how children, students, really even adults who have different behaviors can still have the same lacking or missing innate need. So the first story I'm going to talk about is a young man who struggled with aggression. The second story I'm going to talk about is a young lady who was a drama queen. And the last story I'm going to talk about is a young lady who was a perfectionist and really from the outside looking in had everything she really ever needed and potentially wanted as well. But let's take a moment to break down these emotional and behavioral struggles and even some addictions, and I'm going to show you how they whittle down to one of the 7 lacking or missing innate needs. So the first story is about a young man who was around 13 years old. He had explosive outbursts. He had violent behaviors. He was the bully. He would just terrorize and taunt the other students, and it was as if that just made him feel so good to make others feel really bad. He also had failing grades. He was very tough to handle in class, and he missed a lot of school. Now, I want you to think for a second about this young man, and I want you to begin to take that first, second perspective and think about what's your true feelings of this young man. How many would say that this is just a bad kid? You know, he came from a bad home life. His family struggled, and he's just never going to break the cycle. He's just a bad kid. How many would think that there might actually be a reason for these behaviors? So let me take you behind the scenes and let me share the story with you about this young man who had these really ugly, horrific behaviors and violent tendencies and anger outbursts. Let's talk about where that started. And once again, the concept that this young man didn't wake up one day and just decide to do that. Just like the oak tree doesn't just grow overnight, a seed was planted and it began to grow. So this young man, when he was little, he actually had a lot of love in his heart for his mother. She was like his best friend. And because his mom had a lot of weeds in her garden and she really never had the tools or knew how to get help and change that generational cycle, this little boy was exposed to a lot of unhealthy men in his life. One of his stepdads was very abusive. And there were many situations and many instances where the young man would come home from school and the stepdad would be hitting his mom. And he would come home and he would watch this happening and he wanted to stop it so bad, but he didn't know how. And all that anger would fester and grow. And it continued on day after day. He watched this domestic violence scene happen over and over and over. So one day he came home from school and he decided enough was enough, and he jumped on his stepdad's back and he tried to beat him, to try to hit him to get him to let go of his mom. And the stepdad threw the little boy down to the ground, and then he beat him up too. And you can imagine the seed that got planted. He decided that day that he was a failure or worthless, right? Because he couldn't protect his mother, the one person who he loved more than anything. So the seed got planted that he was a failure, and also that he didn't deserve to be loved, because he couldn't protect his mother, and so really he just was not worthy of love. And you see that sad seed got planted, and in time it began to grow and grow. When I train these stories with students, I usually try to make a point to share how important it is to not hold pain and anger and hurt inside of our hearts, because hate and anger is like a poison in the garden of our life. And it will begin to grow and fester, and it will get worse. You know, we have this tendency to believe that holding hate and anger towards one person will stay focused on that one person, but we weren't made that way. It will eventually grow and grow and grow, almost like an addiction. When a person takes drugs to numb the pain, and then they take more and more and more, anger and hate works the exact same way. And so this little boy would go to school, and all that pain inside came out. It came out of his mouth, his hands. It came out on everybody around him. And that pain continued to just pour and come out. And the irony of all of this is that young boy actually became just like the man that he hated the most. He hated his stepdad, and he became just like him. You see, it's so important to remember that the human mind, that our heart really is made not only like a garden, but it's also made like a volcano. Think about the earth. When all that pain or all that lava and heat and pressure is trapped, right? If the volcano was sealed shut and all of that pressure couldn't come out, it's going to do one of two things. So volcanoes can explode, or they can actually implode and create a crater lake. And so that's what happens with our students. That's what happens with our children. That happens with adults, with trauma that is not dealt with pressure and pain. And so when you see the explosions, that's many times our students who have the violent tendencies. Fight, flight, or freeze. They're the fighters of the world. And I tell these students that it's really a great gift that they have to be a fighter. I'm so thankful for my students who have that ability to fight and push through and get stuff done. But the problem is when that fighter part of the personality, that strength, is partnered with hate and anger, it can really cause some damage to the world. The same thing goes for those who are imploders. When the volcano, the caldera, implodes, that's when we begin to see our students who harm themselves and don't want to be here anymore. Another thing I tell my students who are exploders, I tell them, listen, you're a little fighter. And if we're on the battlefield, Miss Shauna wants you beside me on the battlefield. I want you there because you're a fighter. We need you in this world. We have to have you. I'm the runner. I'm the flighter, right? I'm like the Paul Revere. I'll run and tell everybody that there's a battle coming, but I don't want to be on the front lines. So you see these children we work with, they have gifts. We have to begin to see it differently. When that gift is partnered with love and wisdom and unconditional acceptance, the seed gets pulled, the emotions and the behaviors will change. So the story about this young man is actually has a great ending. He's one of the long-term cases that I follow. He's doing very well. He has a family, and that young man pulled those weeds and he changed the beliefs in his mind, and he realized that it wasn't his fault, that he was worthy of love and he deserved love, and that he was not a failure, that his stepdad had weeds that he never dealt with. These students can stop these generational cycles. And I get excited about the concept of seeds because I really do believe it's that simple. And we're going to talk later, once again, about verbal affirmations and strategies that you can do to help pull those weeds out of a child's heart and sow seeds of love and really put oxygen on that child, or give them electrolytes, but emotionally when they're struggling. And the reality is, some students are going to need lots of therapy as well. Some of our students really just need some positive innate needs sowed into their life, and they only have a few weeds. Some children come to the school system, unfortunately though, with fields and fields of weeds. They don't just have a nice little white picket fence garden. They've been exposed to trauma over and over and over and over. So it's going to take all of us. It's going to take teachers, parents, guardians, school resource officers, nurses. It's going to take counselors. It's going to take mental health therapists. It's going to take all of us to help these students heal and get to a place of a garden that is thriving and growing more healthy vegetables and flowers than weeds. Here's the second story I want to share with you about. It's a young lady who is around 14 years old, and she was the drama queen. She was that young lady that was always wanting attention in class, always seeking attention. She would lie and manipulate with the best of them. It was like when she spoke, you pretty much knew there was going to be something untrue come out of her mouth. She would sneak out at night. She had very unhealthy relationships. She would pop pills. She was a cutter. And not only that, another behavior that was really hard to deal with was that she would turn this girl against this girl, against this girl, against this girl. And that, of course, is a very ugly behavior when you begin to see girls splitting each other. It was really a personality disorder that was budding and developing. So this young lady, how many of you, from your first perspective of this young lady, how many of you would say that this girl is just doing this for attention? I can tell you I was a school teacher before I was a counselor about 18 years ago. I taught school for a few years, and I can honestly tell you at that point in my life, I would have thought that that young lady was just doing that for attention. And the reality is, like the Jason Foundation states, Clark Flatt, who is the founder of the Jason Foundation, who lost his son to suicide, Clark Flatt talks about how a myth is that our students are just doing it for attention. So the reality is these students really are doing these things for attention because there's a reason behind the scenes. There is a need for the deed. There's always a need for the deed. So let's go behind the scenes and let's talk about what was going on with this young lady. You see, this little girl was raised in foster care, and when she was first born, she was put into the foster care system because her parents had lots of weeds in their garden and they were addicted to drugs and alcohol. And so this young lady was handed over multiple times into several foster care homes over and over and over. And this continued on until she's a teenager, and I don't even remember the amount of foster care homes she had been in, but the list was very long. This young lady she recalled a memory of when she was young, and she was watching the biological parents hold their children. And she even said this one home, the parents were great to her, they were really kind to her. But she said, I knew that my parents gave me up when I was a baby. And she said, I began to believe that I must not be lovable. If my own parents could give me up, I'm not worthy to be loved. And so that seed got planted and it began to grow. Now let's talk about how that seed, once again, creates those negative emotions and those negative behaviors. So how did that come out? She began to sneak out at night and find love in the wrong places, like we talked about earlier in the video. She would pop pills to try to numb her pain. She would cut to try to alleviate emotional pain, but physically that wasn't going to eliminate her pain. Another thing that she would do is she would turn this girl against this girl, against this girl, against this girl, because really her deepest fear was being alone. Remember the 7 and 8 needs, belonging. And of course we already know she didn't feel loved. And so she would turn them against each other because her hopes were that they would get mad at each other, but they wouldn't get mad at her. Because that feeling of being alone actually in the brain registers next to the feeling of dying. Human beings, once again, were made for a connection. For connection, we were not meant to be alone. So that pain and that hole, that gaping hole of belonging and acceptance is deep, very deep-rooted, and can cause some really ugly weeds in a person's life. So this young lady, the amazing thing is she got help. She's actually doing very, very well. She changed that distortion in her mind. In seed digging, one of the approaches that we use is a trauma model. We use cognitive behavioral therapy. We use psychodynamic therapy. We use therapy models to go back to the root of when that trauma started and help that young lady change the distortions in her mind. And neuroplasticity teaches us that students can do that. They can actually rewire, for lack of better words, rewire those neural connections and create new healthy pathways. Dr. Caroline Leaf talks about the brain and how it actually looks like seeds and branches. And when seeds get planted, or cognitive distortions, lies about who we are and about ourselves, when those seeds get planted, there will be pathways. And that is the behaviors that are created. So when we pull a sad seed and we change the distortion in our brain, it's like pulling a thorn bush out of the ground and replanting a positive seed of truth, which to her was that she did belong, that it wasn't her fault that her parents struggled as well, and that she was loved and she did belong and have a purpose. And of course, when the distortions change, the behaviors change as well. Now we're going to talk about one final story, and this story is about the perfectionist. And my goal with sharing this story, as I did the previous two, is to once again show you that it doesn't matter what walk of life we all come from. It doesn't matter what weeds or behaviors we exhibit. At the root, you will always find the 7 and 8 needs, or a variation that is lacking, and basically where that person is struggling on that hierarchy of needs. So So this story is about a young lady who was about 17 years old, and from the outside looking in, she had everything that she really needed. She had a great family, she had a nice car, nice clothes, a nice home, she had good grades. She was really, once again, from the outside looking in, she was doing just fine. But for some reason, she wasn't happy. Life wasn't good enough, and she was depressed. So when you think about this young lady, what's one of the first things that come to your mind? So when I share that story of the perfectionist that really had life on a silver platter, does anyone have the thought that maybe this girl is just spoiled? I mean, come on. If you think about the first two stories, they have a reason for the behaviors that they had now that you know the backstory. But how many of you would say this girl, I mean, come on, she's really had life too good. That's why she's spoiled. I love to pause here, and I love to tell people when I share these stories, when I tell students these stories, and when I share these stories with adults, it's so important for you to look around the room and always remember that every person in the room, every one of us has a story. We all have a story. And it's so important not to judge a garden by its weeds, a book by its covers. It's so important not to judge people based on their successes or failures. But because behind the scenes, once again, there's always a reason for every behavior. Let me take you behind the scenes with this young lady. This girl actually did have a wonderful life. She had wonderful parents, but she was abused outside of her home environment from the age of 3 for several years following that. And the abuser would tell her that she was bad, that it was all her fault, and just horrible things about who she was as a person. And when those seeds got planted, once again, they began to grow. And they grew and grew and grew. And by the time she was a teenager, she had developed coexisting eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia. She was very depressed. She had a lot of anxiety. And there was a period of time during her teenage years that she didn't even want to be alive. She ended up at Arkansas Children's Hospital at 17. But you know, this girl, she got help. And she realized that she was so much more than what the abuser said. And she realized that she did matter, that her life mattered, and that she was important, and that she was loved, and that it wasn't her fault, and that she wasn't a bad kid. And when those distortions, when those concepts changed in her brain, a new seed was planted. Seeds of hope and acceptance and love were planted, and new outcomes and new pathways began to follow. This young lady went on to college, and she became a school teacher. She became a mental health counselor and a mom and a wife. And the story of that 17-year-old who struggled with perfectionism is actually my story. I was that young lady who struggled, and my parents had no idea what had even happened to me because I was left with a trusted family member. And so I want to say this today as I wrap up this section, that it is so important, once again, to not judge a book by its covers or a garden by its weeds, because we all have a story. But I'm also living proof that children and adults can heal. They don't have to live with this deep-rooted pain. There really is a way that they can overcome that pain and live lives and be whole and be happy. One more thing before we wrap up this section, I would like you to take out the student application activity worksheet one more time, and we're going to fill out section number 2. And so I want you to take the little stick figure, our little stick figure, and I want you to begin to look at the possible seeds that could be planted inside the heart of that fictitious student that you chose and that you wrote down specific behaviors for the weeds.